Then my next function is to introduce Joe Smith, who's going to introduce Bishop Braxton. Joe?
Thank you very much, and let me as well welcome all of you. It is exciting that we can come together and discuss this topic in person at a wonderful location. And I have the distinct honor of introducing to you our mayor of the city of Indianapolis, a young man whom I've known for 30 plus years, I guess. But he's the mayor of our city, and I think doing a great job. Now you must understand, he's only here to welcome us because we kind of squeeze into his schedule. He does have other events this evening, so he's going to leave shortly after he gives a welcome to the bishop and to all of you. May I introduce our mayor, Joseph Halton.
Well, I also want to offer you good evening. Good evening. You've had pastoral welcome. You've had parishioner welcome. Now let me offer you, Your Excellency, municipal. I do want to thank our pastor, obviously, to my dear friend Joe Smith, who, may God bless his soul, described me as a young man. You're in church. I will be brief. I look forward to listening to tonight's conversation. I won't be able to stay long, but I do hope to make it to Marion University tomorrow, Bishop. I know that you will be engaging yet another audience there. I'd simply say to all those gathered, whether you are parishioners here at St. Thomas Aquinas, which has been a wonderful place of worship for the church and for its parishioners for so many years, a leading light in the Catholic community here in the city of Indianapolis, and a parish that particularly underscores the many great strengths of Indianapolis, which include our diversity. That is something that I try to say as often as I can, because it is what I truly believe, that diversity brings strength. But saying diversity is our greatest strength doesn't mean that it's invincible. In fact, our diversity and what it means to live out those values each and every day is perhaps our most vulnerable strength. For some, it just is unfortunately difficult to see life through the eyes of someone who may look differently than they do. That unfamiliarity, that inability to recognize all our similarities despite some small differences diminishes our efforts to live in harmony with one another. But that doesn't mean we ought to stop trying. In fact, what that means is we all need to try harder. If indeed it takes a village to raise a child, then it takes a whole community for our brokenness to be reconciled. And while there are many ways to go about accomplishing that, one way So let us do so now tonight. Let us, all who are here to witness, go forth tomorrow, share your testimony. Let everyone know that harmony is obtainable once we start to listen and understand the other. It starts with us, and it starts tonight. And it starts with conversations led by His Excellency. So on behalf of the city of Indianapolis, thank you for being here. Thank you for caring enough to come out on a Saturday evening and engage in these kinds of conversations. And let us, tomorrow morning, think anew and act anew. May God bless you.
One more introduction. Jim Trippi and I have the distinct honor and privilege to introduce our keynote speaker for this evening, Bishop Edward K. Braxton, Bishop of Belleville, Illinois. Bishop Braxton was born and raised in Chicago, where he was ordained. His academic accomplishments include a Doctor of Philosophy and Religious Studies and a doctorate in Systemic Theology from the Pontifical Catholic University of Louvain in Belgium. He served as the William A. Coleridge Professor of Ecumenical Relations at Harvard Divinity School and a member of the faculty of the University of Notre Dame, the Catholic University of America, and the Pontifical North America College in Rome. He also served as special assistant for the theological affairs to the late James Cardinal Hickey when he was Bishop of Cleveland, and later when he was Archbishop of Washington, D.C. He served as the Cardinal's personal theologian, research assistant, and theologic resource person of the diocesan curia. The bishop later served as the director of Calvert House, the Catholic Student Center at the University of Chicago, and as the official theological consultant to the William Sadleir Company, a publisher in New York of Catholic religious education. He's author of several books, and his writings on a wide range of theological and pastoral topics have appeared in the Harvard Theological Review, the Theological Studies, and the Louvain Studies, and many other journals. Bishop Braxton was a priest in the Diocese of Chicago, and he was ordained as the auxiliary bishop in St. Louis. He became the second bishop of Lake Charles, Louisiana, and he was installed as the 8th bishop of Belleville, Illinois. In 2015, he issued his pastoral letter, The Racial Divide in the United States, a reflection for the World Day of Peace 2015. In 2016, he published the companion pastoral letter, The Catholic Church and the Black Lives Matter Movement, The Racial Divide Revisited. You can obtain those writings from the diocesan website, www.diobelle.org. The title of his address this evening is The Racial Divide in the United States. Please join me in welcoming His Excellency, the Most Reverend Edward K. Braxton.
I'm certainly very happy to be with you this evening. Very grateful to Dr. Trippy for inviting me and your pastor, Dr. Schwab, for welcoming me so warmly to be in Indianapolis and in Indiana. I've been in most of the states in the United States, but rarely in Indiana. And when I've come to Indiana, it has almost always been to go to St. Meinrad's, the great Arch Abbey, to give retreats, or to go and retreat, or to visit the great Father Cyprian Davis, Dean of African American Historians, who died at the Arch Abbey 2 years ago. So to be here in the Archdiocese of Indianapolis, certainly in the news now that our Vice President is from the state of Indiana, and the governor. I learned today that Vice President Pence and his wife were married in this sanctuary. So it's especially interesting to return and to come to a church named for the great Thomas of Aquin, Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas has had a great influence on my life as a theologian and writer. As I'm sure you know, the great Dominican scholar Thomas Aquinas was a Titanic thinker in the life of the church in the 13th century. His writings, where he derived his thoughts from Moses Maimonides, Averroes, and Aristotle, transformed the church. And the writings of Thomas Aquinas in his Summa Theologica and his Summa Contra Gentiles have shaped the church for centuries. His poems, like Los Solitaris and Tantum Ergo, are still a major part of our liturgy, both in Latin and in English. So to be in a parish church named for Thomas Aquinas is a special grace for me. Because of the seriousness of the topic that we are going to broach with you, and because of the need for divine help in all things, I'd like to begin with a prayer. Prayer in the name of Father Augustus Tolton, priest from the Archdiocese of Chicago, whose canonization is under consideration by the Holy See. So we pray this prayer with hope for his inspiration, and that we may follow his example. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. O God of love and justice, O God of mercy, we give you thanks for the life of your servant and priest, Father Augustus Tolton. He labored in our country at a time when many who were members of your body, the Catholic Church, were blind to the cruel injustice of capturing, buying, and selling free human beings and forcing them into bondage under the lash. We thank you for Father Tolton's example. Though frail in body, he was strong in spirit and did not allow this nation's original sin, prejudice, segregation, and rejection to keep him from following the gospel of Christ, who is your Son. You enabled Father Tolton to see the same Christ in others, even those who scorned him, those who rejected him, those who hated him. Father Tolton's ministry nurtured the seed of the Catholic faith in the African American community in the Archdiocese of Chicago, in neighborhoods not unlike some of the poor neighborhoods here in the Archdiocese of Indianapolis, such as, I understand, Martindale Brightwood is a neighborhood very similar to the kind of community Father Tolton served in. And so we pray that your faithful servant will continue to inspire us all and imbue us with the confidence and the hope we need to continue to water the seed for your new evangelization in cities all over this country. We pray that you will glorify your servant, Father Tolton, and bring him to the altar in canonization by hearing us tonight as we pray through his intercession, that the different communities of the community of Indianapolis will work effectively to bridge the racial divide in this city, this church, these neighborhoods, and our hearts. Purify our hearts of bias and prejudice of every kind. Remove the weapons of violent words from our mouths and the weapons of violent deeds from our hands. Make us all true instruments of your peace and reconciliation. And Lord our God, help us to spread Father Tolton's story and imitate his humble example of unselfish service, which is as timely as this evening's newspaper. Hear our prayers, O Lord, through Jesus Christ, the bridge builder, the liberator of the oppressed, and the Prince of Peace. Amen. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Hopefully all of you have an outline so you'll know where I'm going. And if you have an outline and if your Roman history is acute, you see there's a mistake. After Roman numeral 3, you see Roman numeral 6. It should be Roman numeral 4. I will have to chastise someone in the office for that. We will not go from 3 to 6. So our remarks tonight will cover serious topics about which we have only a limited amount of time. And so it is very important for you to realize that I will be touching on a variety of themes, but not addressing them in depth because of the limitation that we have. But the outline makes it clear to you that the theme of our reflections tonight is this: the Catholic Church and the racial divide in the United States. Langston Hughes, the great poet and a giant of the Harlem Renaissance, described the racial divide in the United States when he wrote the poem, A Dream Deferred. Langston wrote, "What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load, or does it explode? What happens to a dream deferred?" I notice in looking up at the Archdiocese online that in your beautiful Cathedral of Saints Peter and Paul, in the back by the entranceway, there is an Afrocentric crucifix in your cathedral. How it came to be there, I do not know. It is certainly a rare sight in a Catholic church. And so for a prologue, I'm going to ask you to use your imagination and imagine a very different kind of Catholic church than the one you know. Imagine a Catholic church in the United States in which most of the Catholics in this country are people of color, and white people are members of a very small and very poor so-called minority group. Use your imaginations. Imagine yourself as a white American teenager living in a poor Indianapolis neighborhood with few opportunities for you to get a good education and find a meaningful employment. Imagine that some of your friends are troublemakers, and when the African American police come around, they often intimidate them. This frightens you because another white friend of yours was shot and killed by African American police when he reached into his pocket for his wallet, which they thought was a gun. Since you were very young, your parents have cautioned you to avoid any contact with the police because they are likely to suspect you of wrongdoing. You and your friends, all of whom are white except for one, whose families are struggling to make ends meet, live in the neighborhood where there's a Catholic church, but you've never been inside. You and your family are not Catholics. Indeed, some of your relatives think of the Catholic Church as a black racist institution, which traditionally has had no interest in inviting white people to join the parishes. You and your friends feel that a church that promises the joy of eternal life after you die while offering little help in your daily struggles is not very meaningful. You feel that you need a church that will be at your side, engaging in the struggle, helping you to find a God of the oppressed, an angel of freedom and justice. You need a church that embraces and celebrates and is informed by the white experience. If God is to really be God for you, he must be God the liberator. Now, imagine that your one African American acquaintance, sensing that you are discouraged, persuades you to go with him to that very Catholic church, St. Charles Zawanga, and just to go in and walk around. You enter the church, and all the images of the divine, all the images of the sacred are in Afrocentric art. All images of Jesus, Mary, Joseph, all the saints are as people of color, Africans, Hispanics, Asians, or even Native American. And God the Father himself is painted on the ceiling in very large icon on the ceiling of the church as a very distinguished, older African gentleman. You think to yourself, but God the Father is absolute spirit. He has no race, no nationality, no anatomical gender. Scripture never describes him as an elderly, African-looking, brown-skinned man. You wonder if the Catholic Church believes that only people of African ancestry are in heaven. You notice that even the angels in the church have African features. But if angels have no bodies, no gender, if they are pure spirits, why are they not represented in all races? Just think of the impact it would have on unchurched white people like you if they encountered the image of a magnificent white angel with blonde hair, rosy cheeks, and blue eyes when they entered a Catholic church. Just think what an impact it would have. You ask your African American acquaintance, wouldn't the Catholic Church be more truly Catholic, more universal and welcoming of all people, if the holy men and women of the Bible were pictured as people of different ethnic and racial backgrounds? After all, though we know they were Jewish, no one knows what they looked like. Jesus may not have had a beard or long hair. All Semitic people certainly do not look like Western Europeans. But your friend responds, oh, that question has been asked before many times. And the response is usually a very simple one. People who are white should realize that Afrocentric art clearly represents them as well, because Afrocentric art is universal. You ask your acquaintance, does the Catholic Church intend to perpetuate this all-black image of heaven in all the churches of the future? And your acquaintance responds, well, there are a few churches in big cities with large numbers of minorities where they have painted white angels and white saints. But you know, most of the older white people don't like it. They say they could not possibly believe that God could look like them. They could not possibly believe that God could look like them. But you ask, surely in our very diverse country, would it not be a powerful statement that the church would mandate all future Catholic churches would have racially diverse images of God, Jesus, Mary, saints, and angels? Wouldn't that convey a much more authentically universal image of the divine, of the sacred, of the holy, of the mystery of God? But your African American friend responds by saying, I think I know what you're talking about, but I really don't think that's ever going to happen. I really don't think that the Catholic Church is going to get rid of her magnificent and centuries-old Afrocentric art and paint Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, and the angels and saints as white? Why not, you ask? Why not? Section 2 of this reflection is called A New Awareness of the Racial Divide. The racial divide in the United States can be traced, of course, to the tragedy of the so-called European slave trade that captured innocent, free human beings from West Africa and brought them to the United States to be, quotes, sold, bought, and owned in bondage to work on the lucrative plantations in the southern states where tobacco and cotton and sugarcane were the great source of income. As a matter of fact, several serious studies have shown that money was the primary engine of the buying and selling of human beings from West Africa. So much money could be made because human beings were used as beasts of burden to do the grueling work of the plantations. This was the primary reason why it was thought there was no way that they could end this practice. And long after the cruel evil of slavery was ended, its consequences continue to cast a shadow over our nation as a racial divide. Down to our day, and in recent years, dramatic eruptions of racial conflict have made this shadow more apparent. And in the last few years, painful accounts of breaking news call Americans to rededicate ourselves to the work of peace and reconciliation among our citizens of different races, ethnic origins, and social, cultural, educational, economic, and religious backgrounds. Of course, as members of the Catholic Church, as members of the body of Jesus Christ, we know that this is more than a call. This is more than a political idea. This is our very vocation, born of baptism. We are baptized as members of the body of Christ. Nevertheless, a long history has meant that there are very few people of color in the Catholic Church in the United States. I understand here in the Archdiocese of Indianapolis, there are a handful of African American Catholics in a few parishes like St. Rita Parish, like St. Andrew Parish, and a few here in St. Thomas Aquinas Parish, and some as well in Holy Angels Parish. Indeed, I was speaking with Father Eusebius Imbodiaka, a priest from Nigeria who's serving in my diocese, who once served here, I believe, as the administrator of St. Rita Parish. And he said, well, Bishop, there are just not very many African American Catholics in Indianapolis. In the United States, we have about 70 million Catholics. Don't worry, they're not in church on Sundays, but we have them. About 200,000 in this archdiocese. They probably aren't all in church on Sunday either. 70 million Catholics, the largest religious denomination in this country by far. There are 1,300,000,000 Catholics all over the world. Until recently, the largest individual religious movement in the country until the advent of Islam. Now there are 1,600,000,000 followers of Islam all over the world. Out of the nearly 70 million Catholics in this country, about 2.8 million are African Americans. There are many neighborhoods and many dioceses in this country where Catholics have infrequent contact with African American Catholics. Some people say they never have any contact. Many say they've never ever seen an African American sister, an African American priest or deacon, and certainly not an African American bishop. We are the rarest of orchids in the field of the church. But in recent years, Catholics all over this country, like the rest of the country, have pondered the distressing events in cities around the United States. These events include the deaths of young men of color during confrontation with local white police officers. And these events also include the public expressions of grief by family members, the reaction to grand jury decisions that seem unreasonable, as well as the concern about the person who shot and killed these men. These events have led to unprecedented unrest in our country, including not only peaceful demonstrations, but also the taunting of police, violence, senseless destruction of property, and heinous revenge murders, where police officers are shot down in revenge for the death of young men of color in cities around the country. In reading over the history of the Archdiocese of Indianapolis, while I see many evidences of the racial divide going back generations, some of which I will speak about tomorrow, you have been spared this calamity of incident after incident of young men of color dying in altercation with representatives of the police. But I'm sure you are very aware of these incidents, that they are news all over the country. I used to list all of these in some of my presentations. Now I do not, because there are so many, the entire presentation would be spent listing them all. But before I talk about some of them, just to remind you of how the racial divide is manifest in our country, let me begin by making 10 observations about certain points with which I hope we will agree. I'm hoping that you will agree. And these are all about the topic of our greater awareness of the racial divide. The first point I would like to share is that each of the accounts of encounters between white police officers and young men of color ending in the death of these young men, each one is unique. They have some similarities, but they should not be looked at as simply the same event. Each one must be studied without stereotyping. Secondly, we each realize that our views about these complex events are influenced by our age, education, family background, personal experience, religious beliefs, and the media, which may make difficult situations worse if the reporting is sensational or biased. A third key point is this: the death of the individuals who lose their lives in these incidents are very sad events and a source of great grief and sorrow for their family. But it is also true that the experiences of the police officers who caused these deaths are also a source of sorrow for them and for their families. A fourth point that can never be overstressed: the work of a police officer is very, very difficult, very dangerous, because the violence in American society is so great, they leave their homes each day not knowing if they will return unharmed. They deserve our respect and our gratitude. They are forced to make split-second decisions, life and death decisions, on which their lives and the lives of others depend. Every community needs dedicated police officers to keep order and to protect the citizens and their property. Most police are fair-minded and respect the human dignity and the worth of all citizens. Some, however, are not. Some, however, are not. There is credible, documented evidence that bias and prejudice influence the attitudes and the actions of some police officers, no matter what their race or nationality may be. It is a fact that some men of color, some African American men, commit crimes requiring their arrest by the police. However, this should not lead to the demonization of all young black men as dangerous, violent criminals. It is a fact that some white police officers use excessive force and display racial prejudice when they interact with black men suspected of crimes. However, this should not lead to the demonization of all white police officers as racists ready to kill black men at the slightest provocation. A fifth point: some individuals firmly believe that it's completely inappropriate for religious leaders such as myself to make any comments about these events concerning the racial divide of the United States, beyond very pious generalizations about let's work together for peace and justice, let's be kind to each other. Others firmly believe that the gospel compels religious leaders to address such issues forthrightly, in spite of their complexity, in a constructive spirit of mutual respect and reconciliation, without presuming to judge or to condemn others. A sixth point: in some communities, African American males are taking the lives of other African American males in alarmingly high numbers. This is a fact. Several investigations suggest that 93% of African Americans who are murdered by other African Americans, and 84% of white Americans who are murdered by other white Americans. The seventh point: none of us know with certainty exactly what happens in these painful circumstances of violence. We were not there. We have no way of knowing for certain. Perhaps only God knows exactly what happens. And of course, unfortunately, in each of these cases, one of the participants is dead. The eighth point: all American citizens have the right to protest peacefully and demonstrate when they believe they are faced with unjust laws, unresponsive government officials, and morally unacceptable social structures that do not represent and respect the dignity and the worth of every human person. Everybody has that right. But number 9, no one has the right to break the law by expressing frustration with violence, arson, looting, destruction of property, and endangering the lives of fellow citizens, even killing. This inexcusable crime response only undermines the efforts of those with legitimate grievances. And 10, most American neighborhoods are made up of people of similar racial, economic, and cultural backgrounds. As we were driving down a beautiful neighborhood with Dr. Trippi I admired the magnificent homes, and I told him I'd been reading about 38th Street, that if you pass 38th Street on one side, there are people living one way, and on the other side, people living another way. Most Americans do not live with people of different racial, cultural background. This is true of most American church congregations. Most American Catholic parishes have very few or no African American members. Significantly, more and more Americans of different races work, socialize, and recreate together and the number of biracial marriages continues to increase. However, the majority of Americans do not have significant numbers of intimate friends of different races, whose homes they visit, with whom they vacation, and with whom they share the most personal feelings and thoughts. And this I find in every diocese and archdiocese where I speak. Most American Catholics, no matter how involved they are in works of justice and peace, white or black, do not have a significant number of intimate friends of different races whose home they visit, with whom they vacation, and with whom they share the most personal and deepest thoughts and feelings of their lives. Catholic people, like other Americans, have reacted in a variety of ways to these deaths at the hands of police officers and court decisions, and to these protests. For some Catholics, these events are simply another fleeting news item that has no real direct impact on them. The participants are not their friends or family members. It is not their neighborhood. But for other Catholics, these are disturbing events, and they are concerned about their impact on our nation, but they do not dwell on them. They're distracted by the next news item. For still other Catholics, there are feelings of anger and frustration about cries of white racism, the criticism of the police, and the attacks on the judicial system, the disruption of normal life by protesters, the destruction of property by vandals, the closing down of streets. As one Catholic layman expressed to me, slavery and racism are a thing of the past, it's over and done with. These protesters should stop complaining, obey the law, pull up their pants, follow the orders of the police, get a job, and get on with their lives. But there are still other Catholics who are profoundly distressed. They feel that they were naive in thinking that the era of racial conflict was behind us. They are upset by the attitudes and comments of some of their friends and neighbors who show no sympathy for and no understanding of what people of color are enduring every day. Some of these individual white Catholics concluding that there is systemic racial prejudice in the United States and through American society that they know is morally wrong. Some of these white Catholics have taken to the streets, taking part in mass nationwide peaceful protests while condemning acts of vandalism and acts of violence. At this point, let me add a personal note. I am not completely an impartial outside observer in the face of the racial divide in the United States. I have had a number of personal experiences that make it clear to me. I'll share with you two experiences that I had with law enforcement officers that made me very conscious of the fact that simply by being me, I could be the cause of suspicion and concern without doing anything wrong. The first experience was when I was a young priest. The second one was when I was already a bishop. In both cases, I was not in clerical attire. I was dressed informally. In the first experience, I was simply walking down a street in an apparently all-white neighborhood. A police car drove up beside me, and the officer asked, "What are you doing in this area? You don't live around here, do you? Where is your car? You should not be wandering around neighborhoods where you do not live." I never told him that I was a Catholic priest, but I wondered what it was that I was doing that attracted the attention of the officer, or perhaps someone who called the officer. This was a long time before I'd ever heard the expression, walking while black. In the second experience, I was driving my car in an apparently all-white neighborhood with two small chairs in the back seat and a table that was in the partially open trunk of the car tied with a rope. A police car with flashing lights pulled me over. The officer said, "Where are you going with that table and those chairs?" Before I could answer, he asked, "Where did you get them?" Then he said, "We had a call about a suspicious-looking person driving through the area with possibly stolen furniture in his trunk." I could not help but to wonder What exactly was I doing that made me look suspicious? I was simply sitting in the driver's seat in my car, driving with the chairs and the table given to me by a wealthy family to take to a poor family very much in need after a fire in their house. I suspect had I said, you know, I'm a bishop of the Catholic Church, if I could have flashed my bishop's ring and my pectoral cross and my zucchetto, I might have been treated differently. But I did not. But I did wonder what I was doing to make someone suspicious. Many years later, I would hear the expression racial profiling. The next section, number 4, a litany of deaths. A litany of death. As I said, there are so many names: Trayvon Martin, Oscar Grant, John Crawford III, Michael Brown Jr., Eric Garner, Tamir Rice. So many names of people who have died in these altercations that it is not possible. Philando Castile, Alton Sterling, there are just too many names. God gave no other rainbow sign, no more warnings, the fire next time. The litany of deaths that we are witnessing in the United States are a result of the fact that there have been undercurrents of the racial divide in the United States to serious observers for a long time. Ever since the civil rights movement, spearheaded by the prophetic nonviolent work of the now assassinated Dr. Martin Luther King, who should be 88 years old now and enjoying his children and his children's children. But from then to the present, there have been a number of commentators who until recently have erroneously suggested that with the election of the biracial American Barack Obama as president, we are now living in a post-racial America. They must have been dreaming. President Obama, now looking back on his presidency, never hid the fact, of course, that he was born to Stanley and Ann Dunham of English and German heritage, and her husband, Baraka actually, and later Barack Obama, Sr. of Kenyan heritage. The president at times seemed to have embodied in his very presidency and his many words and actions from the White House and around the country and the world, he embodied the racial divide in his own person because he embodied the reality of Harvard pioneer W.E.B. Du Bois that he describes in the souls of black folks, of some African Americans. Some African Americans looked at Mr. Obama and said, he doesn't speak forthrightly enough about the racial divide in America. But some white Americans thought, Mr. Obama seems to speak about racism all the time. He never stops talking about it. The president presided over events in the United States in which the misperception of a post-racial era has been shattered by a series of events dealing with encounters between young African American males and white representatives of law enforcement. And many of us, of course, these events take place. We don't pay a lot of attention to them, but if you follow the news city after city and think of how many there have been, it's almost a monthly headline. Just remind yourself of a few. On February 26, 2012, Trayvon Martin was shot and killed in Stanford, Florida by George Zimmerman, a white neighborhood watch volunteer, not a police officer, who told the police that he really looked suspicious. He told the police that he was going to follow him. But the police said, no, don't follow him. Do not pursue Mr. Martin on foot. However, George Zimmerman did. And there was an altercation between the two of them that apparently no one saw but the two of them. And Mr. Martin, who did not have a gun, was shot to death by Mr. Zimmerman. No charges were fired against Mr. Zimmerman by the police, but the police stated that they found no evidence to refute Mr. Zimmerman's argument that his life was in danger. His life was in danger. On August 5th, 2014, Mr. John Crawford III, a 22-year-old African-American, was shopping at Walmart, a store near Dayton, Ohio. He picked up a toy gun and already unpacked, and he was carrying the gun through the store to the counter. But another shopper who saw him called 911 saying, there's a black man carrying a rifle in the store. The caller later conceded that at no point did he, Mr. Crawford, shoulder the rifle or point it at somebody. The two officers from the police who arrived at the store said Mr. Crawford did not respond to their directives to put the gun down and lie down on the floor. Instead, he seemed to try to escape. The officers thought the toy gun was a real gun. They shot Mr. Crawford twice, and he died. He died at the scene. On August 9th, 2014, Mr. Michael Brown Jr., 18, who was unarmed, was shot and killed in Ferguson, Missouri, by Ferguson police officer Darren Wilson, who said he did so to save his own life from the threat of Mr. Brown, who was moving very aggressively toward him. Mr. Brown's body lay in the street for 4 hours after the shooting, with no one even bothering to cover it. On the night of November 24th, 2014, after months of deliberation, the St. Louis County prosecutor announced that the grand jury, having reviewed all of the evidence, decided that there was no reason whatsoever to indict Officer Wilson. This led to great outpouring of protests, outpouring of anger, outpouring of very dramatic protests, not only in St. Louis, but this jury decision led to protests and demonstrations in 150 cities, including St. Louis, Philadelphia, Seattle, Albuquerque, New York, Cleveland, Los Angeles, Oakland, Minneapolis, Atlanta, Portland, Chicago, Boston, and many more. And people began to shout, hands up, don't shoot, hands up, don't shoot, hands up, don't shoot, Black Lives Matter. On July 17th, 2014, Mr. Eric Garner, 44, who did not have a weapon, died in Staten Island, New York, after police officers put him in what has been called a chokehold, a tactic banned by the New York Police Department. The event was recorded on cell phones and spread rapidly via the internet. The police suspected Mr. Garner was selling cigarettes from packages without tax stamps called Lucy's. He had multiple prior arrests for this and other violations, including assault and grand larceny. He was out on bail. Mr. Garner said that he was not selling cigarettes and told the police that they should stop harassing him. When the officers were attempting to arrest him, Mr. Garner backed away, and Officer Pantaleo approached him from behind and put his arms around Mr. Garner's neck, applying what has been widely regarded as a chokehold by those who have viewed the video recording. The officer subdued him on the sidewalk with his face down. Mr. Garner, a married man with 6 children, said over and over again, I can't breathe, I can't breathe. He was taken to a local hospital where he died. Because of the video, it was assumed that certainly the officers would be charged with this offense. But on December 4th, 2014, the Staten Island grand jury announced that there was no grounds for indicting him whatsoever. This is just a brief reminder of the many, many incidents. We could go on and tell you the story of young Tamir Rice, 12 years old in Cleveland, with a toy gun. The police were called. There's a black man with a gun here in this park. And within 2 seconds after arriving, Tamir Rice was shot and killed before they realized it was a toy gun. So this is truly, truly a litany of death. A litany of death. And once again, of course, as sad as these events are, I wasn't there. You weren't there. We cannot presume that we know everything that was going on there. We cannot presume that we know all the factors that influenced the police. But we can see a pattern. We can see a pattern where for some reason, when a young man of color is suspected of having done something wrong, it seems that he cannot be tasered, he cannot be shot in the toe or the finger or the elbow, but is fatally shot and cannot be brought to justice unharmed. In contrast, look at Dylan Roof, the 21-year-old supremacist in Charleston, who walks into the Mother Emanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church. The people are there at prayer over the scripture. He joins them in prayer. They bless him. And while they have their eyes closed for the benediction, pulls out his gun and destroys the lives of 9 people, the slaughter of the innocent. But when the police find him, he is not hit, he is not beaten, he is not harmed in any way. Indeed, they take him to Burger King for some refreshments because he's hungry. The racial divide in the United States. The racial divide in the United States. It is not something of our imagining. It is something very real. The next section of this presentation is on the Catholic Church and the racial divide in the United States. I had the opportunity to be in Charleston speaking recently and had a chance to be in the church of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. Not only was I in the church, but I was in the bishop's residence at the same time that Dylan Roof was being tried. And in the same courtroom, the man who shot Walter Scott, the 50-year-old man who was shot 8 times in the back, said to have been charging at the police officer, but that too was caught on video, and he was running away. It's said to have been taking away the taser from the police officer, but the video shows the police officer putting the taser by the victim who had fallen dead to the ground. But to be in that church and to talk to family members of the slaughter of the innocents was a most moving experience. So now we want to talk about the Roman Catholic Church and the racial divide in the United States. Many younger Catholics in the United States are very surprised when they learn about the flawed history of the Catholic Church concerning the racial divide in the United States. Young students of history are shocked and amazed when they learn that Catholic institutions and religious community actually own free human beings from West Africa who worked the plantations. And they are amazed that Catholic bishops did not forcefully condemn the human bondage, contrary to the gospel of Jesus Christ. It is difficult for them to believe that some Catholic authors actually wrote tracts in defense of the slave trade, and that the church did not vigorously oppose the apartheid-like Jim Crow laws in the South. As you probably know, John Carroll, the first bishop of Baltimore, who founded John Carroll University in Cleveland, where I recently had a very fine opportunity for a dialogue, and who established the great Georgetown University, Bishop Carroll himself, a Jesuit, owned human beings, free human beings in bondage on plantation, a Catholic priest and Jesuit and bishop. Not only that, Georgetown University has recently announced that they've uncovered evidence that the Jesuits who built the university sold nearly 300 of their slaves to wealthy Catholics in Louisiana to pay for the buildings. The current president, a layman, a wonderful man, has worked very hard to acknowledge this, has found the descendants of many of these victims of this horrible buying and selling, and have done all he could to make amends, changing many structures in the university, free scholarships to their families to go to school, and many other things to try to make amends. But he says again and again, there is nothing we can do to undo what was done. We can say how sorry we are. We can say how regrettable we are, how much we regret it, but we cannot undo what has been done. And this has been the case in the Catholic Church throughout many, many generations. Not only church leaders buying and selling human beings and thinking nothing of it, not only looking the other way during the post-Civil War, not being enthusiastic about the Emancipation Proclamation, looking the other way during the Great Migration when people of color moved from the South to northern cities, looking the other way as neighborhoods went from white to black because of the resegregation of parishes in the cities in the northern parts of this country. So it is news to many younger Catholics that men and women of color were excluded from seminaries and convents and generally could not become priests or sisters except those orders designated for colored people. They could join the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament, designated for colored people. They could join the Society of the Divine Word of the Josephite priests, designated for colored people. Indeed, in my own years as a seminarian in the Archdiocese of Chicago, I learned the history of the ordination to the priesthood of an African-American priest who was ordained not with his classmates in the great splendor of the seminary's great chapel, but in the private chapel of the Cardinal Archbishop by himself, so that the wealthy white Catholics would not see that he was ordaining a colored priest. This is our history. This is our history. Maybe unknown to some of you. It's not in the textbooks that most Catholics read when they're reading about church history, but I do not believe in alternate facts. It is a revelation to them to learn that Joseph A. Francis, the late auxiliary bishop of Newark, New Jersey, an auxiliary bishop in the diocese where your archbishop is now the cardinal archbishop, to the amazement of some, but not to all. At any rate, dear Bishop Francis, an extraordinary auxiliary bishop of Newark, who spent all of his years as an auxiliary bishop, was never giving a diocese of his own for mysterious reasons. Dear Joe was often asked by people when he would speak at conferences like these, people would say to him, Bishop Francis, I cannot understand why there are so few African American Catholics. I just can't understand. Do you have any explanation for it? And Joe, with a wry smile on his face, would say, well, if you had seen and heard what I've seen and heard, if you had experienced what I've experienced, if you knew the true history of the Catholic Church in this country with regard to people of color, you would not be amazed that there are so few African American Catholics. You would be amazed that there are so many. You would be amazed that there are so many. Young students of history in the Catholic Church are equally surprised, however, at the efforts that many in the church have made to move beyond this painful, flawed legacy. A number of Catholic priests and sisters were very active in the civil rights movement, working and marching for racial integration in the North and in the South. Not a large number, but a significant number. Catholic schools and urban communities have made extraordinary educational contributions to the intellectual and moral formation of African American youth, many of whom were not Catholics, and many of whom have become leaders in our land. The Catholic Church has also been in the forefront of programs to confront sources of poverty, which is a fact in the lives of so many African American families. And the Catholic Church has made many statements. Going back to 1958, the American bishops published Discrimination and the Christian Conscience. And in 1968, they published National Race Crisis. And then later on, in 1979, they published the landmark pastoral letter, Brothers and Sisters to Us, a pastoral letter on the sin and heresy of racism in the United States. And that is a wonderful document. I was not a bishop when it was published, but I did help Cardinal Hickey and Bishop Joe Francis to edit that text of Brothers and Sisters to Us on the sin and heresy of racism in the United States. However, the wonder is probably more than half of the dioceses and parishes in the United States never saw that document. It was never distributed by their bishops. It was never read to them by their pastors. They were never asked to study it in small groups. They were never asked to implement its specific recommendations. For whatever reason, this document came and went. Yet you could take that same document today, other than changing the statistics, most of what it said could be said again. Some progress has been made, but most of what it said could be said again. Indeed, the American bishops are in the midst of thinking of publishing in 2018 another pastoral letter on the sin and heresy of racism in the United States. But some Catholic lay people and some priests and some bishops say, does the Catholic Church really need to say more, write more, publish more, or does the church need to do more? To do more. I think the church should do more, but at the same time, I acknowledge it is not always easy to know what to do because we have such a complex history, and the barriers, the cultural, the social, the educational, and belief system barriers are complex. And no matter how much one might want to, the Catholic Church cannot wave a magic wand and say, well, we want everything to be better, and we want all of you wonderful people who are excluded from the church, come on down, you're welcome. Well, people have long memories. People have long memories. And people of color who are very happy now in their Baptist churches, very happy now in their African Methodist Episcopal churches, very happy as Jehovah's Witnesses, very happy as Seventh-day Adventists, very happy as Methodists or in other faith traditions, and some, of course, especially men who've been in prison, very happy as followers of Islam. The Catholic Church is not that appealing to them. The church is seen as a little breathless and a little late. The church is coming forward and asking for them to become involved in the life of a church which always seemed alien to them. And the only way I can see significant progress being made is for the church to go through some very serious examination of conscience, as well as for individual Catholics to get involved in changing the reality and the appearance. But that is not easy, especially at this juncture. We're at a juncture in the Catholic Church where the church's resources are constrained. The number of priests is getting smaller. The number of priests are growing older. Their health is not as good, so we bishops are asking priests to take not one parish, not two parishes, but 3 parishes in many of our dioceses, in archdioceses. And many dioceses and archdioceses, more than half the priests are over the age of 50. And so it's unreasonable to expect priests who are in the second half of their lives in ministry to have the energy and the zeal and the enthusiasm they had as newly ordained 26-year-olds. Now, 2 things I often hear when I say that, well, Bishop, you bishops just have the courage. Ordain married men and ordain women, all your problems will be solved. I don't know that all of our problems would be solved. I do know that we don't have the authority to make that decision. So we don't spend a lot of time thinking about what we cannot do. We need to do what we can do, and whether or not that would be the solution, I do not know. And others say, well, get some of those foreign priests, meaning Fidei Donum missionaries. There are all these foreign priests. They're over there in Africa somewhere. Just bring some of them over here. There are no foreign priests over there in Africa somewhere. Priests are needed all over the world. Fidei Donum missionaries, just as we sent missionaries to other countries in the 1920s and the 1930s, when some of our dioceses had more priests than we need, just as Ireland sent priests to this country in the 1920s and 1930s. There are some dioceses, like the Archdiocese of Onitsha in Nigeria, where Archbishop Valerian Okeke has 600 seminarians in his seminary and ordains 30 and 40 priests every year. I've ordained 20 or 25 at a crack when I've been over there with him, and receives hundreds of postulates, nuns, 200-300 nuns at a time in his religious community in long, flowing blue and white habits. But he does send priests to other countries because of the need. We call them Fidei Donum priests, given in faith, but only after they've been carefully screened and prepared for the shock of leaving the church in Nigeria to coming to the church in the United States. No bishop who's wise will ever accept a priest who's just out there, sends you an email, oh, Your Excellency, my Lord Bishop, I'm Father John Jones, and I'm just living in London right now, but I'm available to serve in your diocese. Well, why are you available? Why are you, if he's out there with no papers and no letter of recommendation from his bishop, any bishop who takes him in the diocese is looking for trouble, and he usually finds it. He usually finds it. So, the next section is on the question, and this may be the most important section of this presentation because it's the one that I find most people find so difficult to accept. This is number 6. There are no minority Americans and there are no minority Catholics. I generally find that people hear this and say, well, that's nice, Bishop, but no thanks. If I were to ask you this simple question, how many of you here are members of minority groups? Raise your hand. Don't raise your hand. But if I were to ask that question, ask yourself, would you raise your hand? If I were to ask this question, how many of you here are not members of minority groups? Raise your hand. Don't raise your hand. Don't raise your hand. But ask yourself, are you somebody who would raise your hand? This is a most interesting topic. How it has come about that the United States is divided between the majority and various minority groups. Various minority groups. And language has meaning, and the words we use carry weight. And when we divide the country between minorities and majorities, the weight of that is often very negative. Are there really minority Americans? Are there really minority Catholics? Though these expressions are regularly used in the media, by the government, certainly in Catholic Church documents, they are radically incorrect, and they exacerbate the sometimes difficult relationship between people of different ethnic and racial groups. They are radically incorrect, and you may say, well, of course they're correct. It's obviously that Hispanic Americans and African Americans are minorities, and white people are the majority. Is it obvious? All right. People who come from Sweden by ancestry or from Luxembourg by ancestry are statistically a small part of the American population. But wonder of wonders, they're not in a minority group. People whose families come from Jewish backgrounds were once called minorities, but they're almost never called minority groups today. People whose ancestors come from Ireland were once considered the dirty Irish, unwelcome minorities, but not today. When you hear in the evening news, there's going to be a special on the problems of minorities in our cities. Do you think it's going to be about Japanese Americans? Do you think it's going to be about German Americans? Polish Americans? Irish Americans? You know that's a code word, primarily for African Americans, perhaps for Hispanic Americans, and less for Asian Americans. And often it means people who are poor, uneducated, unemployed, and from broken family structures. And it begs the question, who among us American citizens are the majority group? In this country, there are no ethnic Americans in the same sense that we might speak of ethnic Japanese in Japan. There's no single ethnic group or racial group or cultural group that constitutes true Americans. Every citizen in the United States is fully and equally an American in the exact same sense of the word. Citizens who are descendants from passengers on the Mayflower are not somehow more truly American than descendants who were passengers on slave ships, or the most recent immigrants from Iran or Syria. Even Native Americans should not be called minorities. They're hidden away. The United States granted them citizenship in their own country in 1924. But they are not members of a minority group because they are Americans. If they are American citizens, they are Americans, precisely because there are no ethnic Americans. A careful reflection on the meaning of the expression e pluribus unum, one for many, excludes the possibility of designating minorities in this country unless all citizens are so designated. Obviously, this truth is not fully accepted by most sectors of American society. European Americans with roots in Ireland or Italy, for example, were once ostracized in this country as immigrants and foreigners, undesirable minorities. The same is true of Jewish people. But why are they generally not called minorities today? The answer is not because any of these groups now constitutes the statistical majority of our population. As Matthew Fry Jacobson explains in his book, Whiteness of a Different Color, European Immigrants and the Alchemy of Race, and as you find in the book called How the Irish Became White, an amazing book, How the Irish Became White. When you read the book How the Irish Became White, you see that there is a process through which Americans whose ancestors were from various European countries with very little in common grouped themselves together as the majority to build a wall to protect themselves from the movement of poor people of color from the South in the Great Migration in the 1920s and the 1930s. And in big cities like Chicago, Philadelphia, Boston, New York, St. Louis, and Indianapolis, I'm sure there was a certain sense that these specific groups were minorities competing for the jobs, the housing, the education of the majority. And this has been institutionalized so that everyone almost uses the language minorities, minority groups. And it reinforces something that is sometimes called white privilege. If we refer to people as what they are not, they're not the majority, then we diminish them. Just as the Catholic Church, I think, is wrong when we refer to our brothers and sisters of other Christian faiths as non-Catholics. Our Protestant brothers and sisters don't particularly like being called non-Catholics, or they sometimes call themselves that. But Presbyterians, Lutherans, and Baptists and Episcopalians, they are Christians of other traditions. I've never heard a Presbyterian call me a non-Presbyterian. I've never heard a Baptist call me a non-Baptist. I've never heard a Lutheran call me a non-Lutheran. Such language primarily speaks of people by what they are not instead of what they are. How hard is it to say our brothers and sisters of other Christian traditions? And in this gathering, we have Lutherans, Methodists, and Presbyterians. It doesn't take very long to say who they are. How long does it take to say, we wonder how involved the African American and the Hispanic American community are going to be in this event, rather than how many minorities are going to attend? It is language that reinforces what is often called white privilege. However, I've tested this idea in many settings, and no matter how, and I've given major whole talks on this subject, there's an unwillingness to even consider this idea because it requires a paradigm shift. Some of you may be familiar with the writings of Thomas Kuhn, the philosopher of science, in his book, The Structures of Scientific Revolution. And in that book, Thomas Kuhn speaks about a paradigm shift, how someone like Ptolemy conceived the cosmology of the world as the earth is at the center and the sun and everything revolves around the earth. That was a worldview. And then the Polish priest Copernicus, because he had a telescope, there was a Copernican revolution, said, no, the sun, the earth is just one of many planets moving around the sun. Ptolemy's explanation of things just couldn't bear up under new knowledge. So it's a paradigm shift from an earth-centered or geocentric system to a heliocentric system where the sun is at the center and the planets move around it. That's a paradigm shift. That's a shift away from a model that seemed to explain everything. The same is true with majority group language. It takes a paradigm shift to realize that if you say that you're going to pick a certain group, even if in some cities like Cleveland, where the majority of the population may be African American, or San Antonio, Texas, where the majority of the population may be Hispanic American, they will still say, don't you know in San Antonio, the majority are minorities. The majority are minorities. They just can't become the majority no matter what. It takes a paradigm shift to grasp what I'm talking about. In other circumstances with more time, which we don't have, I explain it further. Now, the conclusion of this presentation is ordinarily brief, but I'm going to make it briefer than it would be because of the time that we've taken so far. Let me just say, the conclusion of this talk would have focused on the need to do this, to listen, learn, think, pray, and act. And in the pastoral letter, The Racial Divide in the United States, in this pastoral letter, it is designed with activities for small groups. Listening, learning, thinking, acting, and praying, so that you can follow up what I'm saying by getting this online. You don't need to buy it. Go online, the Diocese of Belleville, you can download it. It has activities for listening, learning, thinking, praying, and act, so you can contribute in your own local neighborhood, in your own local situation, to the solution. It's very important. You can contribute yourself to the solution, but you must, I think, heed each of those imperatives. In order to bridge the racial divide in the United States, it is very important that we open our minds and hearts and listen to other people who disagree with us. Listen to them and learn what they think and stand under their points of view. Listen, learn, think, and then we must pray, and then we must act. But we must do all of those things. Listen, learn, think, pray, and act. And so I'm not going to elaborate on that because we're already after, it's 9:15, 9:20, we must conclude. But get the text, use it. It's been used in many dioceses, in many seminaries, in many colleges, and generally people have found it very helpful. It's a program. It's a program to help you to work in your own local situation to bridge the racial divide in the United States. Let me conclude with these words from John Donne, the Anglican priest and poet, who really understood the universal nature of our humanity, that we're all kin. He wrote, "No man is an island entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. If a clod be washed away by the sea, Europe is the less. Any man's death diminishes me, because I am involved in mankind. Therefore, never sin to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee. Thank you. Thank you very much.